early in 2014, Silver State Voices convened a core group of our partners, and we were really looking at, how are we going to develop and implement a robust long-term plan for election modernization? And something to note about Nevada is we have our legislative session every 2 years for 120 days. So we were kind of, in 2014, we were looking forward to the legislative session in 2015. And so we really wanted to make sure that we had a plan in place and that we weren't just looking at, 2015, but also like what we could get in 2017 and, so on. And so we got together and we said we need to do this well. So we, at that point in time, we met with election officials, we met with legislators, we met with public agencies, really just to kind of gather information on like what policy and like what regulatory, opportunities there were for reform. And so this information, after we gathered this, really developed and influenced this incremental approach agenda that we set. And so we began, after we collected that information and kind of got a good understanding of what was possible, we began holding monthly meetings. And these were with in-state partners and with national partners. The Brennan Center was one of our partners that has been participating in our in-state coalition. We really just wanted to share information and kind of move this agenda forward. And so, as Denora mentioned, we started this early in 2014, and, the legislative landscape in Nevada had been pretty neutral. We had voter ID bills come up in the past, but they didn't have any legs. But also then in terms of modernization, nothing was moving forward. So this was really our attempt to move that forward. And so then, we planned all this, we had this agenda, and then the 2014 election happened. And as Denora mentioned, the Nevada Assembly and the State Senate shifted to Republican control for the first time in 40 years. So, that happened. The Secretary of State had campaigned on, a platform of voter ID. The governor, Brian Sandoval, he had previously, expressed support for voter ID, and he had actually vetoed legislation in the past that would have reduced election deadlines, and he also vetoed legislation that would expand voting rights for the formerly incarcerated. So, voter ID became a very real possibility and other voter suppression. In fact, 4 voter ID bills were introduced. There was a citizenship verification bill that also was alive through to the very end of session, and then there was other ones that would reduce early voting. So at this point, in 2014, after the election in November, we held our monthly coalition call, and we kind of had to shift our agenda. And so we expanded the coalition, and we said we have to primarily focus in opposition to voter ID and other suppressive legislation. And by the time the voter ID hearing actually came up, our coalition consisted of 54 organizations with, from labor, advocacy, direct service, and faith. And so as we grew the coalition, we also branded it. We called it and we became Let Nevadans Vote Coalition. The need to fight back on these regressive measures really brought partners to the table that, might not have been there and we might not have reached out to otherwise. So we also reduced our proactive goals, but we kept the focus on systems improvements, including electronic poll books and digitized voter registration at the DMV. And then we used this two-pronged approach, so we were saying we were on the offense and defense, so always presenting solutions at the same time that we're criticizing voter ID. And then we used Brennan Center messaging, their national messaging, to create localized talking points. And we were always moving the conversation towards our priorities of engaging around the concept of election integrity. And so we not only stopped all the regressive measures, because our legislative session just ended in June, but we also won one proactive measure for voters to opt into an electronic sample ballot. And so, while some of our other proactive measures didn't become law, we did see Republicans amend the bill that was gutting, early voting to instead protect it and expand it. And ultimately, this bill didn't move because there was one kind of controversial, problematic piece, and it ended up dying. But we also saw a senator who had introduced voter ID. When talking about early voting, he said when 2/3 of the state vote early, it's not a privilege, it's a right. And so, we were also just able to use these hearings to push the DMV, to push the Secretary of State, and really move forward some of this modernization as well, and lift up the conversation. So, with that.
So that, I think, highlights some of the lessons learned, right? So it was organizing the coalition early on, making sure that they were engaged, both to push forward an offensive agenda, as well as, once the election results came out, to be on defense and push back against some of the voter ID efforts. Leora's coalition was incredibly successful in conducting surveys and really getting their messengers out to talk about how voter ID would have a disparate impact on their community. And so that was, like, I think one of the key lessons learned probably is just really getting that coalition together early, getting the non-traditional voices, so not just the core groups that work on good government issues, making sure that racial justice groups, religious and faith leaders were also at the table to be a part of elevating that conversation. Henry, I want to hear a little